On the morning of Sunday, August 5th, 1962, the congregation of Reverend Otis's church gathered as they had for decades, dressed in their finest, filling the wooden pews, waiting for a sermon that would never be finished. The air was warm, thick with the scent of old hymnals and Sunday perfume. The choir had just taken their seats when the first gunshot rang out. Gasps erupted. A woman screamed. Reverend Otis Langston stood at the pulpit, his hands still gripping the sides of the podium as his body swayed. A crimson stain spread across his chest, blooming through his starched white shirt. His mouth opened, but no words came, just a choking gasp as his knees buckled beneath him. Then, the second shot. His wife, Zelma Langston, collapsed before she had time to process what had happened, and standing at the front of the church, in full view of the congregation, was the shooter, not a stranger, not an enemy, his own mother, the woman who had raised him, the woman who had shaped his faith, the woman who had carried a secret so monstrous, so corrosive, that she would rather watch her son bleed out at the pulpit than let the truth be spoken. A secret that had been buried for nearly 4 decades, a secret Otis had just begun to uncover, and when he decided to speak, she silenced him forever. But what had he learned? Why did his own mother fear the truth so much that she would kill? And how deep did the deception run? By the time the service was over, the church floor was soaked in blood, and the walls that had hidden generations of sins had finally begun to crack. Because what happened in that church wasn't just a murder. It was the unraveling of a crime that had been in motion long before that gun was ever fired. By the time Claudine Langston turned 59, she was a woman of both reverence and whispers. She carried herself with the grace of a pastor's widow, the kind of woman whose name commanded both respect and quiet speculation. In the small southern town of Pine Bluff, Florida, she was regarded as a pillar of the church, a mother of the faith. But there were things about her that were always left unsaid. She was still an attractive woman, even in her late years. Too attractive, some said. For all her outward devotion, for all her years of playing the grieving widow, there was something unsettling about her presence. Women in the congregation would notice the lingering stares of certain men when she passed by. They would exchange quiet glances when she spoke too closely, too softly, too familiarly with men who weren't her husband. Because Claudine Langston was no grieving widow. The man she had married, Pastor Harlan Langston, had been dead for nearly 4 decades, and while the town had accepted his passing as the work of divine will, there were always those who whispered that his death had been too convenient. His wife had never truly mourned. She had moved on too quickly, too privately, too comfortably. And now, in the year 1962, she was still moving. There were rumors, of course. A woman as widowed yet untouched as Claudine was bound to have them. Some said she still had a man's company behind closed doors. Some said she had never stopped seeing the man she was seeing before Harlan died. They weren't wrong, because Claudine Langston's affair had never ended. And the man she had been entangled with for over 40 years, the man who had stood beside her in the church, who had comforted her after Harlan's death, who had baptized her children and laid hands on her in prayer, was none other than Deacon Josiah Beauchamp, the very man who had helped her kill her husband. In the late 1920s, Harlan Langston was a man struggling to hold his house together. He had been a respected pastor, a man of faith, a man of discipline. But what he hadn't been was a man who understood the woman he married. He had loved Claudine, but he had never controlled her. She was too independent, too sharp, too restless, and by the time she was 23, she had already betrayed him in the worst possible way. Her pregnancy should have been a blessing, a sign of God's favor upon their marriage. Instead, it was a ticking bomb, because the child growing inside her was not Harlan's. She knew it. Josiah Beauchamp knew it. And eventually, Harlan figured it out too. For weeks, the Langston household became a war zone behind closed doors. Harlan wasn't a violent man, but he was not a fool either. The truth was impossible to ignore. His wife had laid down with another man, and now she carried another man's child under his roof. For a Southern pastor in the 1920s, there was no greater humiliation. A divorce would have ended his career. A scandal would have ruined his name. A child that wasn't his own would have made him a walking disgrace. And yet, Claudine refused to beg for forgiveness. She did not fall to her knees in shame. She did not weep for mercy. She did not plead for her husband's acceptance. Because she knew something Harlan didn't. She wasn't going to be his wife for much longer. On the night of August 11th, 1924, Pastor Harlan Langston took his last breath. The official report stated that he died in his sleep, the cause attributed to an unknown medical condition. The town mourned. The church grieved the loss of their spiritual leader. His widow, young and heartbroken, received the congregation's sympathy. No one questioned it. No one looked closer. No one asked why in the days leading up to his death. He had begun telling people that something wasn't right in his home. No one asked why, in the years following his death, Claudine and Josiah never truly stayed apart. For nearly 4 decades, they had kept their crime buried beneath a church built on lies. But sins don't stay buried forever. Because the son they had protected, the son they had raised under a false name, the son they had unknowingly married off to his own sister, was about to unearth the truth. And this time Claudine would not let the past resurface. Not without blood. For years after Harlan Langston's death in 1924, Claudine Langston played the role of a grieving widow perfectly. She stood in the front pew every Sunday, dressed in dignified black, her head slightly bowed as if still carrying the weight of loss. The congregation admired her strength. A woman of God, resilient despite tragedy. But behind closed doors, Claudine had already begun reshaping her world. With her husband gone, she had no intention of living in the shadow of a dead man. She still had her child, the one that wasn't Harlan's, but had been forced to carry his last name. She had Josiah Beauchamp, the man she had always wanted, the man who had helped her dispose of her husband, like he was nothing more than an obstacle, and she had a church willing to follow her lead. For the next decade, Claudine lived without suspicion. She ensured the church flourished under her guidance, subtly influencing the men who now took charge, ensuring they never looked too deeply into the past. And as for Josiah, he never officially moved into her home, but there was no need for that. Their affair never ended. It only became more strategic. They were careful, calculated, controlled, until 1926, when everything threatened to collapse again. The birth of Zelma Beauchamp was an unexpected complication. Josiah, now married to Odessa Beauchamp, had tried to leave Claudine behind, at least on the surface. He had taken a proper wife, a woman untainted by crime, a woman whose innocence made him appear respectable. But Claudine never really let him go. She was always there, always close, always watching. And when Josiah's new wife gave birth to a daughter, Claudine saw something different. It wasn't just a child. It was a risk. Because now, there was another branch of Josiah's bloodline living in the same town. Another child that could one day ask the wrong questions. But the town didn't see the tangled mess of deception underneath. All they saw was 2 respected families raising children in the same church, and no one knew that those 2 children were siblings. Through the late 1920s and into the 1930s, Otis Langston and Zelma Beauchamp grew up together, unaware of the bond they truly shared. They played in the same dirt roads, ran through the same fields, and attended the same Sunday services, sitting just pews apart. Otis was the son of a widowed preacher's wife, and the church saw him as a child destined for greatness. He was raised with discipline, taught to follow in the footsteps of the father he never actually had. Zelma, meanwhile, was the daughter of a quiet but respected deacon. She had her mother's grace, her father's sharp mind, and a future that seemed bright. From childhood they were tied together. And through the years, as they matured, that tie turned into something deeper. By the early 1940s, as America went to war, the two of them had grown into something that no one dared question: young love. And while Claudine and Josiah watched from a distance, they knew something neither child could ever suspect. That love was a ticking time bomb. Because the moment Otis and Zelma chose each other, they had unknowingly sealed their fate. A fate that would one day lead them to the very pulpit where their lives would be stolen. The Langston-Beauchamp engagement was announced in early 1946, just as the world was adjusting to the aftermath of war. The town rejoiced. The church called it a divine union, a blessed event, a marriage meant to continue the legacy of the faith. A young preacher's son taking his place at the altar with the daughter of a respected deacon. It was a match the congregation had prayed for. Only two people weren't celebrating. Claudine and Josiah knew that their children's love had outgrown their control. They had let it continue for too long, hoping fate would intervene, that Otis would find another woman, that Zelma would be led in another direction. But fate was not on their side. Neither of them could dare stop the wedding without raising suspicion. Because why would a mother oppose her son's happiness? Why would a deacon refuse to bless his daughter's union? Why would either of them try to stop something that seemed so perfect? The answer was simple. They couldn't. So instead, they did the only thing left to do. They watched in silence as their children unknowingly walked into a nightmare. The wedding was held in the spring of 1947. The church was filled to capacity, a grand event for a town that had nothing but pride in its young couple. Otis stood at the altar, his heart pounding with excitement as he watched Zelma walk down the aisle, completely unaware of what their vows would truly mean. Claudine sat in the front pew, her hands folded, her face perfectly composed. Josiah stood with the deacons, his jaw tight, his hands steady. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them stopped it. They let it happen. The rings were exchanged. The vows were sealed. And a kiss that should have never happened confirmed their fate. As the church clapped and sang, as the town celebrated, the two people who had orchestrated everything for decades sat in their silence, knowing that what had just happened was not a blessing. It was a curse. And no matter how much they tried to control fate, they had just locked themselves into a truth that would one day come to light. Because a marriage built on a lie can only last for so long before the foundation cracks. And when it did, blood would be the price to pay. For nearly 15 years, Otis and Zelma Langston lived what the town of Pine Bluff considered a model marriage. Otis had stepped into his father's shoes, taking over New Hope Baptist Church as its revered pastor, guiding the congregation with the same authority and devotion they had seen in his late father. Zelma was the perfect preacher's wife, graceful and steady, supporting her husband as he built his legacy. But beneath the polished exterior, beneath the whispered praises and admiring glances, the cracks had already begun to form. And the ones who saw it first were the very people who had spent their entire lives trying to keep the truth buried. Claudine Langston and Josiah Beauchamp knew that every year their children stayed together. The risk of discovery grew. And there was only so much they could control. It began with small details, things no one else noticed. A photo album left open too long, where the resemblance between Otis and Josiah was too striking to ignore. A family gathering where someone made an offhand comment about how Otis had the same mannerisms as Deacon Beauchamp, more than his supposed father ever did. A question asked by an outsider, someone new to town, who had no reason to believe anything but the obvious. "Aren't you two related? You look like family." At first it was easy to dismiss. Claudine would laugh it off. Josiah would shake his head. Otis and Zelma would ignore it, having never had a reason to question the bloodline that bound them together. But the weight of lies has a way of making itself known, even when no one is looking for it. By the time they reached their mid-30s, the tension had started to weave itself into their marriage in ways neither of them could understand. Otis became restless, a feeling he couldn't explain, a sense that something in his life was misaligned. Zelma became withdrawn, her warmth slowly dimming, though she could never articulate why. They still loved each other. They still stood beside each other every Sunday morning. But something had shifted, and neither of them knew how to fix it, because neither of them knew what was really wrong. For Josiah Beauchamp, the weight of his sins had always been easy to carry. He had lived nearly 4 decades with blood on his hands, with the truth pressed down beneath the pages of his Bible. He had convinced himself that the past was the past, that his secret had been buried so deep it would never be uncovered, until his own body turned against him. In 1961, at the age of 60, Josiah was diagnosed with kidney failure. The doctors gave him less than a year to live, and for the first time in his life he felt fear, not of dying, not of leaving behind the pulpit, or his family, or the life he had built, but of what would happen when he was gone. Because he knew Claudine had always been the stronger one. She was the one who could kill and never look back. She was the one who could lie, manipulate, and control without breaking. But Josiah had never been as strong as her, and as his body grew weaker, as the reality of his approaching death settled in, his mind began to fracture under the weight of everything he had spent a lifetime trying to forget. The dreams started first. He would wake up drenched in sweat, the image of Harlan Langston's face staring at him in the dark. Then came the paranoia. He started seeing things that weren't there, the eyes of the congregation watching him too closely, the whispers of judgment following him everywhere. And then came the guilt, the kind that wraps itself around a man's throat like a noose, the kind that whispers, "Confess. Confess before it's too late." And Josiah, for the first time, began to listen, because he was running out of time. And there was one person who deserved to know the truth before he left this earth: his daughter, Zelma Beauchamp Langston. Zelma Beauchamp Langston arrived at the hospital the way any loving daughter would. She sat beside her father, holding his hand, offering comfort, unaware that the man she trusted had spent his life lying to her. At first his words were soft, almost incoherent. The medication had dulled him, but his guilt sharpened his focus. "There's something you need to know," he rasped, his voice barely above a whisper. Zelma leaned in closer, expecting words of wisdom, of love, of farewell. What she got instead was a nightmare. Josiah didn't start at the beginning. He didn't tell her about the affair first, or the betrayal, or even the murder. He went straight to the part that would shatter her. "You married your brother," he whispered. Zelma didn't react at first. The words didn't make sense. She blinked, shook her head. "What?" Josiah's grip on her hand tightened, his eyes clouded but desperate. "You married your brother," he repeated. "Otis, he's my son." The words hit like a physical blow. Zelma jerked back as if she had been burned, her heart slamming against her ribs. Her mind fought against it, refused to believe it. It wasn't possible. Otis was a Langston. He was the son of a pastor, the child of a widow. But Josiah wasn't done. He told her everything: the affair, the murder, the lies, the reason Claudine had never stopped watching her. And when he was finished, he watched his daughter crumble in front of him. Zelma couldn't breathe. Her marriage, her love, her life, everything she had ever believed in, was a lie. Her body shook violently as she tried to comprehend it, tried to process the sheer magnitude of what he was saying. She wanted to scream. She wanted to tear the room apart. She wanted to undo everything. But there was nothing to undo. It had already been done. And as the truth settled into her bones, a different kind of clarity took over. Josiah had spent his whole life keeping this secret. He had let her marry her own brother. He had watched her live a lie and said nothing. and now, in his final days, he thought he could cleanse himself with a confession. But it was too late to ask for forgiveness, too late to pretend that the truth changed anything, too late to undo the unspeakable sin that had already been committed. Zelma rose from her chair, her body moving on instinct. She looked at the man she had once called father and realized she no longer recognized him. She didn't say a word. She didn't cry. She simply reached for her purse, pulled out a small pocket tape recorder, and pressed stop, because she had instinctively recorded every single word. At first, it was to keep her father's last words recorded so she could listen to them in remembrance of him, but it ended up as an evidence. And when she walked out of that hospital room, her father was still whispering her name, begging her to stay. But Zelma never looked back, because now the truth was hers. And she was going to make sure Otis heard it too. The night Zelma Langston returned home from the hospital, she moved like a ghost in her own house. She barely registered the familiar walls, the pictures, the furniture she had picked out over the years. Everything felt foreign, tainted, unreal, because nothing she had believed was real anymore. Her hands trembled as she reached into her purse, pulling out the small tape recorder. The device felt heavier than it should have, as if it carried the weight of generations of sin. Josiah Beauchamp's voice was still trapped inside, whispering secrets that should have never been spoken. And now, Otis had to hear them too. Otis Langston sat at the dining table, a cup of coffee growing cold in front of him, his mind focused on nothing in particular. It had been a long day at the church, and he was expecting the usual evening routine. Zelma preparing for bed, quiet conversation, a few moments of peace. But when she stepped into the room, he knew immediately that something was wrong. Her face was pale. Her hands were clenched. Her body carried a stiffness he had never seen before. She didn't speak. She didn't explain. She simply placed the tape recorder on the table, pressed play, and let the confession spill into the silence. Josiah Beauchamp's voice filled the air, weak but clear, shaking but undeniable. And as Otis listened, his entire world collapsed. At first he didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't react. The words made no sense. The truth was too big, too grotesque, too impossible. His wife, his love, his partner, the woman he had built a life with, was his blood. His father, the man he had spent his life honoring, wasn't his father at all. His mother, the woman who raised him, guided him, molded him, had lied to him from the moment he was born. Everything, his marriage, his faith, his identity, was a lie. His hands clenched the table so hard his knuckles went white. He wanted to scream, but there was no sound that could capture the horror inside him. He wanted to run, but there was nowhere left to go. Instead, he turned to Zelma, his eyes wild, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. This can't be true. But she only stared back at him, her own grief a reflection of his own. I recorded every word, she whispered, and just like that, he knew. There was no escape. There was no rewriting this. There was no erasing the truth, and that's when the rage set in. Otis stormed out of the house, his heartbeat roaring in his ears. His feet moved without direction, his body fueled by something he couldn't contain. He had to confront her. He had to see her face. He had to make her say it to his face. By the time he reached Claudine Langston's house, the sun had long since set, and the air was thick with the weight of the coming storm. He pounded on the door, his fists slamming against the wood like gunfire in the night. The door creaked open, and there she was, his mother, the woman who had spent his entire life shaping him into a lie. She didn't look surprised. She didn't look afraid. She only looked tired, as if she had known this moment would come. And when she finally spoke, her voice was calm. Too calm. Go home, Otis. But he didn't move. He stood there, shaking with rage, his breath coming in ragged gasps. I know everything, he said, "and you're going to answer for it." For the first time, Claudine's expression shifted. A flicker of something, not fear, but something close to it. Because she knew. This wasn't over. Not yet. Otis Langston had always believed that God's justice was greater than man's. But standing in front of his mother that night, the weight of betrayal suffocating him, he realized there were some sins that no divine mercy could erase. Claudine Langston, the woman who had raised him, the woman who had shaped his faith, his morals, his entire existence, was a fraud. She had built her entire life on deception. She had killed a man to protect her secrets. She had let him marry his own blood. And when he had come to her, demanding answers, she had barely flinched. She had not denied it. She had not begged for forgiveness. She had not even pretended to be ashamed. Instead, she had stood in the doorway of her home, her face calm, her voice cool and steady. "Go home, Otis." But he didn't leave, and the longer he stood there, the more he realized what had to be done. "You lied to me." The words were slow, deliberate, filled with a venom Otis had never spoken before. Claudine's lips pressed into a thin line, but she did not deny it. "You let me marry my own sister." His voice rose with each syllable, his anger turning sharp, cutting. "You let us build a life together while you sat in the front pew, knowing the truth the whole time." A long silence stretched between them. Then finally Claudine sighed, tilting her head slightly. And when she spoke, her words were colder than he had ever heard them. "You should have never gone looking." Something in Otis snapped. His hands curled into fists, his body trembling with fury. "I'm going to the pulpit this Sunday," he said, his voice shaking with rage. Claudine's breath hitched, her nails digging into the edge of the doorframe. "I'm going to tell the church," he continued, stepping closer, his face inches from hers. "I'm going to tell them about you, about Josiah, about what you did to my father." For the first time, Claudine's mask cracked. A flicker of something, panic, fear, realization. Otis saw it, and he knew. She wasn't afraid of what the congregation would think. She wasn't afraid of scandal or shame. She was afraid of losing control. Because her entire world was built on the lie she had created, and if that lie crumbled, so did everything she had spent 4 decades protecting. Otis stormed back home, his blood boiling. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't think. The rage was too loud inside him. Zelma watched him from across the room, her hands clasped together, her body rigid. "What are you going to do?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Otis turned to her, his eyes dark with determination. "I'm going to tell the truth." The words were simple, final, absolute. Zelma's throat tightened, because she knew this wasn't just about the truth anymore. This was about power. This was about control. This was about a woman who had killed once before, and might do it again. Claudine Langston would never let herself be exposed. And if Otis was going to stand in front of the church this Sunday, he was giving her only one option. She had to silence him before he could speak. Sunday morning in Pine Bluff had always been predictable. The people of Reverend Otis's church, dressed in their finest, gathered in the pews and listened as their pastor delivered the word of God. But on August 5th, 1962, the congregation was unaware that they were about to witness a murder. The church was filled to capacity, voices humming with anticipation. There had been whispers all week. Something about Pastor Otis Langston behaving differently, something about tension that hadn't been there before, but no one could pinpoint why. Claudine Langston sat in her usual place, front pew, spine straight, hands folded in her lap. Her expression betrayed nothing. To anyone watching, she was simply a widowed pastor's wife, a devoted woman of faith. But inside her mind, the decision had already been made. Otis Langston had given her no choice. He had spent the past few days preparing. His sermons had been rewritten, his mind made up. He had paced the floors of his home, rehearsing the words that would shatter the world around him. The truth could no longer be contained. Not when his entire life had been built on a lie. Zelma Langston had been watching him closely, feeling the weight of what was coming. She had tried to mask her dread, but it was there in the way she moved, the way her fingers trembled when she adjusted her hat that morning. She had already heard the truth, already played the recording, already felt the slow decay of the life she thought she knew. But today, the world would hear it too. Otis stepped onto the pulpit, a place he had stood for years, a place where his father had once preached before him. The Bible lay open before him, his notes tucked carefully between the pages. The congregation settled in, waiting, and Claudine, still in the front row, tightened her grip around the object inside her purse. The air inside the church felt different, charged with something that no one could name, but that everyone could feel. Otis was about to speak, and Claudine was about to stop him. The sermon began as any other, a slow and steady rhythm, the kind that built toward something greater. But today, his words carried an edge, a weight, a purpose that none of them had heard before. He spoke of truth, of deception, of sins that could no longer be hidden. Claudine's heartbeat quickened. The moment had arrived. Her son was about to expose everything. Her affair, the murder, the lie that had stretched across decades. He was about to speak the words that would ruin her. She reached into her purse. The first gunshot echoed through the church, ripping through the air with a force that sent the congregation into chaos. A moment of frozen silence followed. Otis staggered back, his hand gripping the edge of the podium, his body jerking as blood bloomed across his chest. His mouth opened, but no words came. The second shot rang out before anyone could scream. Zelma collapsed beside him, her body hitting the pulpit floor before she even had time to understand what had happened. The church erupted in screams. Voices rose, footsteps pounded, pews scraped against the wooden floor as people scrambled for safety. And standing there in the center of it all, her pistol still raised, her hands steady, her breath unshaken, was Claudine Langston. She had done what needed to be done. Her son would not ruin her. Her past would not be unearthed. Her lies would not be exposed. But as the congregation turned toward her, horrified, stunned, frozen in disbelief, Claudine finally felt it. The weight, the silence, the crushing realization that despite everything, the truth was still coming for her, because two people lay dead at her feet, and the church would never be the same again. The gun was still warm in Claudine Langston's hand when the first voices finally rose above the shock. For a moment the church had been frozen, a room full of people paralyzed by the horror of what they had just witnessed. Then the screams came. Women clutched their children. Men scrambled for cover. Some rushed toward the pulpit, others toward the doors, their instincts split between witnessing history and escaping it. Otis Langston lay crumpled at the base of the pulpit, blood pooling around him, his white Sunday shirt soaked in red. His Bible, still open, had been splattered with the truth he never got to speak. Zelma's body was slumped beside him, her breath already gone. Her life ended before she could even make sense of what was happening. And standing over them, her revolver still raised, her face like stone, was Claudine Langston. The first person to move was Deacon Isaiah Carter, a man who had served under Otis's father before him, a man who had known Claudine for over 40 years. He rushed forward, hands raised, voice trembling, his body blocking her from firing another shot, even though it was clear she had no other targets left. Men surged forward, forcing the gun from her hand, the metal clattering to the wooden floor. She did not resist. She did not cry. She did not speak. The congregation watched in disbelief as two men grabbed her by the arms, pulling her away from the pulpit, away from the bodies of the son and daughter-in-law she had just executed. The doors burst open. Outside, someone had already run to the sheriff's office. The authorities had arrived faster than anyone could have expected, perhaps because the town had already sensed something was wrong before the first shot was even fired. Sheriff Earl Withers stepped inside, his hat clutched in one hand, his revolver still holstered. He took one look at the scene before him, the blood, the bodies, the gun lying abandoned on the floor, and knew there was no need for a trial to determine what had happened. Claudine was guilty. She did not resist when they placed the cuffs around her wrists. She did not flinch when they led her through the doors of the church, past the congregation she had once commanded, with nothing more than her presence. She walked with the same dignity she had always carried, but dignity meant nothing when you were walking toward a cell that would soon become your tomb. At the police station, the weight of the crime began to settle. Blood had been spilled inside God's house. A pastor had been slain on the very pulpit where he was meant to preach salvation. A wife had died for nothing more than being in the way of the truth. And now, a mother sat in a cold interrogation room, her hands folded, her lips pursed, her eyes revealing nothing. But even as Claudine sat in silence, the past had already begun to unravel. Because her son may have died before he could speak, but the truth had already been recorded. And while she had killed 2 people that morning, the one thing she had feared most, the secret that she had murdered to protect, was still alive. Zelma Langston's purse had been found at the scene. Inside was a small, portable tape recorder. And inside that recorder, Josiah Beauchamp's confession was waiting to be heard. Claudine had silenced her son, but she had not silenced the past. And now, there was nowhere left to hide. The courtroom was silent, packed from wall to wall. The trial of Claudine Langston had drawn in every soul in Pine Bluff, those who had once admired her, those who had once feared her, and those who now saw her for what she truly was: a murderer, a liar, a woman who had built her life on deception, her church on a grave, and her legacy on a crime so dark it had finally swallowed her whole. She sat at the defendant's table, her hands clasped together, her posture as regal as ever. Even now she refused to bow, but it no longer mattered, because her past was speaking for her. The tape recorder had been played in open court. For the first time, the entire town heard Josiah Beauchamp's confession, the secrets that had festered in the shadows for 40 years, the truth that Claudine had tried to bury with 2 bullets inside her own son's chest. The jury listened as his weak, rasping voice filled the room. The affair that had led to Otis Langston's birth, the murder of Harlan Langston in 1924, the years of deception that followed, the marriage between 2 people who never should have been husband and wife, the truth that, once exposed, had left Claudine no choice but to kill. The courtroom sat in stunned silence, and for the first time since her arrest, Claudine's expression cracked, because now the whole world knew. Outside the courthouse, the church was in ruins. Not physically, its walls still stood, its stained glass windows still gleamed under the Florida sun, but its foundation had crumbled. The congregation had splintered overnight. Some refused to believe the truth, unable to reconcile the woman they had once revered with the reality of who she was. Others turned their backs completely, disgusted that they had followed a woman who had let them pray inside a house built on blood. The Langston name, once tied to faith, now belonged to a scandal that would never be forgotten. And as the people of Pine Bluff moved forward, one thing became clear. There would never be another Langston behind that pulpit. The church would never recover. And Claudine had not just murdered her son that day. She had murdered everything she had ever tried to build. The trial ended swiftly. The jury found Claudine Langston guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder. The sentence, life in prison. She did not cry. She did not beg. She did not speak. She only stood when she was told to stand, walked when she was told to walk. She was removed from the courtroom in silence, her hands shackled, her future reduced to the confines of a prison cell. For the first time in many years, Claudine Langston had no power, no control, no way to manipulate what happened next. Her story was over, but the damage she had done would never fade. Otis Langston and Zelma Beauchamp Langston were buried side by side, a tragedy that never should have happened, a love that had been stolen by the sins of a generation before them. Their graves lay under the shade of an old oak tree, the headstones freshly carved, their names forever linked not by marriage, but by blood. The town whispered about them for years, how the pastor who had once led them had been living a lie, how the woman he had loved had been his sister, how the mother who raised him had been the one to end his life. And as the years passed, the story became a cautionary tale, a whispered warning, a legend told behind closed doors. Because in the end, Claudine Langston had spent her entire life trying to hide the truth. And all it had taken was a dying man's confession and 2 bullets in a church to drag her sins into the light.